Jak wiecie, niedługo nadchodzi premiera Baldur's Gate'a trójki i tutaj zainteresował mnie bardzo ten tytuł Why They Fear Baldur's Gate 3. Zaraz się dowiemy, o co tutaj chodzi.
large kerfuffle of sorts going on surrounding Baldur's Gate 3, and you may or may not have caught wind of this. But not too long ago, a
Dość duże zamieszanie. Nie jestem na bieżąco, więc myślę, że się dowiemy, o co chodzi.
developer on Twitter posted the following. As a TLDR, in the era of mega games, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the largest attempted, built by a specialized group of people using mature tech specially built to make this specific game, reinforced by invaluable mass player feedback and market validation ahead of its launch. This is not a new
Co? Aha. Bo ta gra jest chyba od kilku lat w Early Accessie i może o to chodzi, tak? Z tego, co widzę.
RPGs. This is an anomaly. Trying to do the same thing in the same way, especially without the same advantages, could kill an entire group of studios. Like a lot of people, I'm deeply excited about what the lovely folks at Larian accomplished with Baldur's Gate 3, but I want to gently, preemptively push back against players taking that excitement and using it to apply criticism or a quote-unquote raised standard to RPGs going forward. And this was followed by a comment made by none other than the legendary Josh Sawyer himself, one of the great luminaries of Obsidian. Great thread. The conditions under which BG3 was made are atypical. This is in no way a slight against the game or the people working on it, who are clearly passionate and talented. The foundation set, and the funding to build things on your own terms is invaluable. And then Rebecca Harwick, senior narrative designer at Grimlore Games, also left a comment for this thread, and said, "Can't be appalled about how much big games cost to make those lavish productions the standard by which all games are judged. I hope Baldur's Gate 3 is a generous, once-in-a-lifetime RPG. I hope no one expects a 10, 20, or 40-person team to make one." Now, in discussing this, one needs to be fair and take account of whatever concerns that people have and factor them into whatever analysis one makes of it. But there are some problems at the outset baked into the statements made by these developers. For one, it seems glaringly obvious that anyone in their right mind would not compare what Larian is doing, a mega-sized studio with over 400 staff members and a significant budget.
Okej, czyli oni mają ponad 400 pracowników i bardzo znaczący budżet. Czyli co? Można powiedzieć, że to jest AAA produkcja, nie?
What a studio of say 10 people and $100,000 can do. Gamers with some awareness are going to instantly recognize a great game produced on a limited budget and not fall prey to comparing it to something of the size and scale of Baldur's Gate 3. A relevant case in point here might be Black Geyser, an isometric CRPG made on a piddling budget by a few people, which unfortunately is currently going under last time I checked. The game was pretty good for what was available to the developers, and no one, and I do mean no one in their right mind, thought, why is this not like Dragon Age, or Divinity, or Baldur's Gate 3? And yes, I am aware that many people have already pointed this out, but I do think it bears repeating. It is unlikely people will look at games with clearly different dimensions and ambitions and budgets and lump them into the same pot.
No to czyli tutaj dalej mamy jakby bulwers ludzi o to, że na przykład bardzo dużo budżet mają na tę grę.
Which at least vitiates part of the argument made by Mr. Nelson and others. However, there is much more to be said about his statement concerning the anomalous nature of Baldur's Gate 3.
Anomalna natura Baldur's Gate 3.
Now, I'm
Ciekawe.
not a developer, nor am I somebody active in the gaming industry, but I do know that Larian's circumstances were indeed highly anomalous, in the sense that they are an independent studio and still managed to put together a lot of money to make this game.
Okej, czyli to jest jakby niezależne studio, jakby nie robi tego tak Microsoft, czy Sony, czy Ubisoft, czy coś takiego, ale jakby niezależne studio i udało im się jakby zdobyć bardzo dużą ilość pieniędzy jakby na tworzenie tej gry.
This means they have no one in terms of a publisher, other than investors and stakeholders, the ultimate powers that be, as it were, telling them what to do or yelling at them about deadlines, which is what Josh Sawyer was alluding to. When you serve a greater power, as does Obsidian Microsoft, you are not
Okej, czyli widzicie, oni nad sobą nie mają akcjonariuszy i tak dalej. Dobrze to zrozumiałem? Nie mają nad sobą kogoś, który by tam krzyczał wydawaj to, bo kasę szkoda.
only beholden to that power determines your budget and to some degree time constraints. And then the ball is only partially in your court as a developer. But somehow, some way, Lord Vinca managed to still procure the funding necessary for this game, all the while remaining independent as a studio. This is seemingly highly anomalous. But is it? CD Projekt Red is also an independent studio, yet no one at the time of, say, The Witcher 3's release and subsequent elevation to one of the great games of our time, made comments along the lines of what we've recently heard. Was The Witcher 3 an anomalously good game? Yes, especially the expansions, which exceeded the base game. But then again, conversely, Cyberpunk, beyond the disastrous release, was a worse game in virtually every respect.
Okej, porównanie Wiedźmina do Cyberpunka, okej.
It was not anomalously bad, but neither was it anomalously good. It was okay.
Okej, no w sumie tak, Cyberpunk był w miarę okej, nie był jakiś super, mega
point
dobry.
Is that there's something different about what Larian is doing that goes beyond the anomalous factors cited by critics. Because if the anomalous nature of the project were the sole criterion, then other studios, such as CD Projekt Red, would have been targeted as well, and there's been silence on this matter. But speaking of anomalies, you might remember the name of a studio called BioWare, now defunct.
Oj, to było studio.
But many moons ago it produced what had been to date some of the, if not the best RPGs out there, and some
No.
of their games set industry standards going forward. Think, for example, of the Mass Effect series, which was one of the first games with a definable voice protagonist with a very specific personality.
No, Mass Effect, dobre porównanie akurat.
You played as Commander Shepard and guided his decisions, but ultimately, Commander Shepard still had his own voice and personality. This format was something radically new when Mass Effect first came out in 2007. Of course, the Codex entries and many other features of that universe helped quite a bit, but Commander Shepard really did change things. So much so,
No
that
zmienił.
certain companies, such as Bethesda, erroneously thought to ape BioWare in this regard by releasing a Fallout game in 2015 with a fully voiced protagonist, something that, much to the chagrin of God Howard and others, was not particularly well received. Still, Mass Effect's lively voiced protagonist set a standard for the industry that has continued today in countless titles, some
A proszę, czyli Mass Effect wyznaczył trendy pewne. Ciekawe.
of which have been incredibly successful, such as the recent two God of War games, which have been critically acclaimed. Now again, the question rears its ugly head. Was the voice protagonist of Commander Shepard, as a feature, anomalous for the year of 2007? Yes, it absolutely was. And yet I do
A, czyli on to podaje jako przykład anomalii.
not recall the vociferous voices of criticism we hear now at that time, enjoining the consumer to restrain his enthusiasm and brace himself for something more pedestrian, because Mass Effect in this regard was anomalous.
Okej, ciekawe.
No, the reality is that anomalies sometimes become generation defining in terms of gaming, precisely because the anomalous games are exceptional and offer players something different.
Okej, czyli on porównuje Baldur's Gate, ta trójkę, to co się dzieje wokół niego i produkcję jako anomalię i ma szansę to stać się dzięki temu czymś wyjątkowym.
That had previously been unknown or unthought of, and in the past, no one thought to bat an eye at something new, innovative, or creative. And yet now we are regaled with admonitions about how we, the player base, must temper our expectations and allow for the insipid and uninspired to once again rule our thoughts, that we might gird our expectations against disappointment by embracing the depressing reality that so much of modern gaming has become.
Kurde, jakie on tutaj słów używa, tak to opisuje, bo nieźle.
As if this were told to us for our sake and our well-being, rather than to act as a cover-up for the all too familiar green-eyed monster that lurks within us all, namely envy. And let's be honest, there's much to be envious of when it comes to Larian's qualities as a studio.
Okej, czyli... Okej, zazdrość tutaj. Ciekawe. Może część osób kieruje się zazdrością, krytykując, no ale to znowu nie możemy uogólniać.
Ambitious, disciplined, devoted, and above all passionate. And speaking of passion, as I intimated in the previous video, I cannot think of a single studio in all the years I spent on Earth to display so much obvious passion for what they're doing.
Okej. Czy to studio, które tworzy Baldur's Gate'a, rzeczywiście wykazuje jakąś wielką pasję do tego? Gra jest długo tworzona. Pytanie, czy tworzą ją, żeby ta gra była naprawdę mega dopracowana, czy żeby ściągać więcej kasy?
And please note Sven hiring out a castle and prancing about in full armor. The half-hearted and grudging respect accorded to Larian seen in this light makes sense, as what they are doing is anomalous, which means it is exceedingly rare. But there are two different ways to interpret the anomalous. On the one hand, to view it as something that will never occur again, and therefore something that ought to be written off.
Okej, no możemy, tak jak mówi, traktować anomalię albo coś pozytywnego, albo
as
coś
we are indeed being
negatywnego.
encouraged to do so by competing developers, or the alternative interpretation, in which to view this, namely in similar fashion to the days of yore, when developers made breakthroughs and brought new innovation, and we rooted for them and celebrated them as a beacon of hope and a sign of positive future change for games. Something to strive for, and ultimately, something to admire. I know which camp I sit in this regard, and perhaps you do too. Thanks for your time, but before I go, I'd like to invite you to my Discord server, where you can discuss Baldur's Gate 3 with like-minded people, as well as other RPGs.
Okej, no ciekawe podejście do tematu. Zastanawiam się, jakie jest wasze zdanie na temat Baldura i tego, co tutaj dostaniemy. Dajcie znać, oczywiście cały film i kanał tej osoby, która go stworzyła, polecam serdecznie, macie w opisie i w przypiętym komentarzu.